Good evening and welcome to Boston College. My name is Melinda Brown Donovan. I'm the Associate Director of Continuing Education for the School of Theology and Ministry. Thank you for being here to explore the topic of hope, the Church's prophetic challenge, with Professors Shawn Copeland, Dominic Doyle, and Richard Lennan. The School of Theology and Ministry is pleased to offer this panel discussion as part of our larger series over the entire year entitled Hope for Healing. The STM offers a wide array of on-campus events such as this one, as well as a roster of continuing education online through enrichment courses with C21 Online. I invite you to preview our spring programs, which are listed on flyers at the entrance. We are hosting 2 more events this semester. The first one is December 4th, Saturday at the Newton campus on Edith Stein, also known as Theresa Benedicta of the Cross. And Francis Cardinal George will be here in this room at 4:30 p.m. on Tuesday, December 7th, speaking about themes from his new book. It's now my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Theresa O'Keefe, who will be our moderator this evening. Dr. O'Keefe is Assistant Professor of the Practice of Youth and Young Adult Ministry and Co-Director of Contextual Education for the School of Theology and Ministry. Theresa?
Good evening. I'll be introducing each speaker just before they begin to speak. Otherwise, if I introduce them all now, you'll forget who they are by the time they get up here. And each will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, followed by the next, and then we will have a chance for you to just kind of sit up and sit down again, after which the panelists will have been invited to the table, and they will start the group process by interacting among themselves, and then the floor will be open to yourselves. Our first speaker this evening is Richard Lennan. Richard is a priest of the Diocese of Maitland, Newcastle in Australia. He's a professor of systematic theology at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. He is also chair of the Weston Jesuit Department and co-director of the school's Licentiate in Sacred Theology. Richard completed his doctorate at the University of Innsbruck in Austria with a dissertation on the ecclesiology of Karl Rahner. Since then, he has authored and edited 5 books and numerous articles, and has contributed chapters in books on issues of ecclesiology, ecumenism, the theology of ministry, and fundamental theology. For 15 years, Richard was on the faculty at the Catholic Institute of Sydney, until he came to Boston in 2007 to teach at Weston Jesuit School of Theology. His previous work also included a term as president of the Australian Catholic Theological Association and wide involvement in ecumenical activities and pastoral planning in Australia and New Zealand. Richard.
Thanks, Theresa, and thank you all for being here. I'm speaking on the Church as a sacrament of hope. Hope and the Church have not been regular companions of late. In the wake of the ongoing tragedy that is the sexual abuse crisis, it is likely that the two have appeared in the same sentence only when the preposition connecting them was for, as in, can there be any hope for the Church? What I'd like us to consider this evening is the viability of employing a different preposition to link hope and the Church, namely of, as in, can the Church be an expression of hope? More specifically, I'd like us to think about the implications of describing the Church as a sacrament of hope. The use of that phrase shapes the particular task that my presentation needs to accomplish, tasks that relate to the 3 questions on your handout, namely to develop an understanding of hope, to clarify the meaning of the Church's sacramentality, and to give some sense of what might be involved in referring to the Church as a sacrament of hope. So let's begin with hope. Our perception of the value of hope can swing between two poles. On one hand, the conviction that hope is necessary for healthy living, that it is what enables us to avoid succumbing to despair in the face of what we can't know, much less control. And on the other hand, the fear that hope is vague, that it lacks a centre, that it's wishful thinking. The latter perception arises primarily when hope is collapsed into optimism. So it's important to distinguish hope from optimism. Perhaps the defining quality of optimism, and where it departs from hope, is that its borders, the borders of optimism, are determined by our capacity to think positively, or more accurately, to think positively about our ability to meet every contingency. Clearly, any church arising from that foundation could be little more than the collective of those resolved to keep smiling, come what may, because of their confidence in their own capacities. Such a community would require neither divine revelation as its foundation, nor grace as its sustenance. Such a community could offer a world in need only the maxim that you can be whatever you want to be. Authentic hope, however, is what leads us out of the self we can manipulate into the God whom we cannot control. As such, hope is a response to God's presence, a motive for ongoing conversion to God, and a permanent feature of humanity's relationship to God. Hope, therefore, is inseparable both from trust in God and from acceptance of the fact that God is for us never less than mystery. Hope reminds us that even in heaven we will see God, as the Irish theologian puts it in a wonderful phrase, beatifically incomprehensible. The confidence that hope expresses, as well as the Christian claim that grace, the encounter with the incomprehensible God, is life-giving, rests neither on wishful thinking nor on an abstract concept of God, but on the self-communication of God in Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit. In Christ, we have the guarantee that our future is secure in God. Trust in that guarantee, which is the foundation of hope, frees us to negotiate the challenges we face in the present, and to do so confident that nothing can come between us and the love of God made visible in Jesus Christ. This grounding highlights the connection between hope and faith. Christian hope is inextricably linked with the revelation of God in Christ, which is also the basis of the Church's sacramentality. The description of the Church as a sacrament is central to the Second Vatican Council's vision of the Church. It is a metaphor that captures both the Church's relationship to God and its place in history, its inner and its outer reality, as well as the irreducible relationship between the two. The sacramental character of the Church has multiple implications for an appreciation of its nature and mission in the world, implications intimately related to hope. First, it underscores the communal identity of the Church. Since the Holy Spirit is shared among all the members of the Church, all of us share equally in the call to be sacraments of the Spirit. Accordingly, responsibility not simply for the Church's life in the world, but for the well-being and authenticity of the community of faith belongs to all the baptised, not simply to those who exercise authority in the church. The communal dimension of the church's sacramentality, its existence as a community that comes about through the other who is God, that comes about through hearing the proclamation of Jesus Christ, resonates well with the dynamics of hope, which also involve the other. If hope involves surrender to what is other than the product of our own efforts, coming to hope is inseparable from receiving an offer outside ourselves. Hope expresses the recognition that we depend on one another, that we are called to solidarity with one another. The link of hope and the other also frames another dimension of the church's life, namely its mission. What members of the Christian community have received is what they are also to offer to others. As sacrament, the church is to orient people to the God of Jesus Christ rather than to itself. As a sacrament, the church is also a pilgrim community, one that makes clear that the life of faith produces an uninsured identity, one that is open to challenge and to movement. The sacramental reality of the church points to the operation of the Spirit within the Christian community and to the need of that community for conversion when it obscures the Spirit. This is not a denial of sacramentality, but the expression of it. The witness to the fact that the holiness of the church is not a synonym for perfection, but for recognition of the church's dependence on God. Authenticity of the church, therefore, no less than the appropriation of hope, requires a willingness to be self-critical, to refuse to call an end to our pilgrimage. And I'll return to this point shortly. A church committed to living as a sacrament of the God who exceeds our grasp will appreciate that tradition fosters movement, that it aids the pilgrimage to God. Since the Spirit is the source of the dynamism of tradition, there will always be a need for the ongoing reception and re-reception of tradition, and for reframing definitions of faith, forms of worship and practices to ensure that they express the life of the Spirit for the present-day believers in their own context. In short, the members of the church will embody a hope that, as Constance Fitzgerald expresses it, is able to eschew keeping a death grip on what has given them assurance of their value and place in the church. On the other hand, appreciation of the church's sacramentality will also express itself in acknowledgement of the church's particularity, of the fact that the church does have an identity. In the words of the French theologian Louis-Marie Chauvet, the recognition of the institutional church as the fundamental sacrament of the reign of God always requires a conversion, either because believers too comfortably ensconced in the institution forget that it is only a sacrament and overlook the distance between it and God, or because their critical suspicion towards the institution results in their not seeing that it is indeed a sacrament. Clearly, there will be tensions between these two dimensions of sacramentality. Hope enables the community of faith to live in that tension. Since hope differs from optimism, it understands that the consolation of God's presence does not remove us to some realm of harmony without tension or reconciliation without questions. The focus on its sacramentality attests to the Church's vocation to be an undreamed of possibility for love, which is how Juan Luis Segundo felicitously expresses the fact that the Church exists to be a means of encounter in history with the saving presence of God. That claim, however, is not an assertion of the exemplary natural virtue of the members of the Church, but an affirmation of faith in what the grace of God can accomplish. The effectiveness of that grace in the individual members of the Church, their common life, and also the structures that support their life and mission is inseparable from the ongoing conversion that is an irreducible dimension of faithfulness to the Spirit. It is this emphasis that highlights that the description of the Church as a sacrament of hope, as an undreamed of possibility for love, is other than a recipe for complacency or for avoiding engagement with the world and its history. As noted earlier, the Church's hope, shaped by its discipleship of the crucified and risen Jesus, enables it to name directly its own failings in the present, while also being able to imagine possibilities that express a more authentic living of that discipleship. Hope, then, includes being able to be obedient to what horrifies, as Paul Crowley describes our mission, to face the forms of death-like birth to which the Church is summoned in its own history. It may well be that in the wake of the sexual abuse crisis, we as Church are living through such a moment when, as Johann Baptist Metz says, the oh so certain discourse about God needs to collapse into helpless discourse with God. This is a moment when hope requires both the willingness to acknowledge painful truths, to enter into solidarity with victims, and to develop different possibilities for the future. Maintaining a focus on the relationship between Christian hope and God's kingdom can free our hope from possible distortions. More particularly, it frees it from the danger of equating the kingdom with our accomplishments. Although hope does not involve a disregard of the present, it is nonetheless true that hope has an orientation to the future, that it stands in contradiction to the reality that we at present experience. Hope acknowledges the sorrows and anxieties of the present, but does not limit reality to them. It is this capacity to face the distortions of the present while also imagining possibilities that establishes Christian hope as utopian. We have become used to hearing utopia as a synonym for unreality, for the wishful thinking mentioned earlier. But as Gustavo Gutierrez reminds us, utopia necessarily means a denunciation of the existing order, the repudiation of a dehumanising situation is an unavoidable aspect of utopia. But utopia is also an annunciation of what is not yet, but will be. It is the forecast of a different order of things, of a new society. Seen in this light, hope is not naivety, not the denial of negativity, but a challenge to what is destructive and a refusal to despair in the face of suffering. Such hope is expressly Christian, since Christ offers not only a consolation in suffering, but also the protest of the divine promise against suffering. It is this hope that the Church's sacramentality encompasses. As a Church, our perennial vocation is to make our own the hope we have in Christ. That hope calls us to face our own weaknesses, to face what is not Christ, and to allow the Spirit to transform us. As we do so, we connect Eucharist and history. We become a means of hope, a sacrament of God's love for the world of which we are a part. Thank you.
Before we rush on to the next speaker, let's just take a moment, collect a thought. make a note to yourself, a question to grill Richard with later. Very good. Our second speaker this evening is Dominic Doyle. Dominic is an assistant professor of systematic theology at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. He was born in London, England, and holds a BA in Theology and Religious Studies from the University of Cambridge, an MTS from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD from Boston College. His interests are in theological anthropology, theology of culture, and doctrine of God, with a particular interest in Thomas Aquinas and Karl Rahner. His first book, The Promise of Christian Humanism, Thomas Aquinas on Hope, will be published by Crossroad this coming April. He's working on a second book entitled Modern Heresies. In 2008, Dominic was granted the Catherine Maury Lacuna Award for New Scholars from the Catholic Theological Society of America. And in 2010, he was a winner of the Templeton Award for Theological Promise. Dominic?
Thank you, Theresa. I should say that the title of the second book I wanted as Disputed Questions in Contemporary Theology, but the publisher thought that wasn't good enough and he adapted it. The title of my talk today is Post-Traumatic Ecclesiology and the Restoration of Hope. The disturbing revelations of clerical sexual abuse of minors and the woeful handling of the situation by many bishops literally beggar belief. The recent Murphy Commission report on the sexual and physical abuse of children by the clergy in Ireland's capital from 1975 to 2004 concluded as follows. The Dublin Archdiocese's preoccupations in dealing with cases of child sexual abuse, at least until the mid-1990s, were the maintenance of secrecy, the avoidance of scandal, the protection of the reputation of the Church, and the preservation of its assets. All other considerations, including the welfare of children and justice for victims, were subordinated to these priorities." End quote. In light of this decade's depressing evidence of repeated patterns of abuse and cover-up, which for many constitute a trauma in their understanding of and attachment to the Church, how are we to talk about hope in the Catholic Church? Today I offer 2 pointers for how a theology of hope can help us construct a post-traumatic ecclesiology, that is, a way of understanding how the Church can heal some of the self-inflicted wounds caused by the abuse scandal. In making these points, I draw upon Thomas Aquinas' definition of hope, that is, the movement of the will towards a future, difficult, yet possible good. My first point, listed on the handout, is as follows. Insofar as hope registers difficulty and thus deepens faith, it creates the basic mindset that opens the Church to reform. My first point is that hope's attention to difficulty provides the conceptual distinctions and basic vocabulary for a post-traumatic ecclesiology. For the Church today, in the midst of the sex abuse crisis, faces acute difficulty as it acknowledges the scale and systemic nature of its failings. To heal wounds, give restitution, prevent reoccurrence, and make painful changes, including changes in the mindset that gave rise to the failings, is no easy task. Addressing this nest of internally generated problems, especially those concerning sexuality and authority, presents the further difficulty that the ones best positioned to make the changes are embedded in the inadequate structures and often soaked in the ideologies that need to be changed. Indeed, that fact constitutes a significant part of the trauma itself, for as the Murphy Commission concluded, many bishops were more worried about the honour of the regiment than the protection of the child. In truth, the way the Church's authorities have handled this situation recalls the understatement in Gaudium et Spes that, quote, believers can have more than a little to do with the birth of atheism, end quote. a judgment that Benedict himself has reinforced with his recent comments that, quote, "the greatest persecution of the church does not come from outside enemies, but is born of sin within the church," end quote. The problem, as Benedict clearly acknowledges, lies within. How might the theological virtue of hope address this urgent need for a post-traumatic ecclesiology that tackles the internal roots of the problem? I will argue that the experience of hope recasts and renews a proclamation of faith that has overlooked and even been damaged by the shortcomings of the proclaimer. The virtue of hope can address the difficulties that arise from an imperfect expression and living of faith. Indeed, hope deepens faith through a kind of dialectical process. What is a dialectical process? It is one that's different from a linear or organic, straightforward development. A dialectical process is one that moves through the negation of incompleteness and tension to resolve that contradiction into a higher unity. The theological virtues, especially the far from seamless development of hope from faith, can be interpreted in terms of this dialectical process of negating tension and incompleteness and moving to a resolution in a higher, more secure unity. To give a clarification by contrast, one could give a simple, non-dialectical account of how the theological virtues unfold. A smooth, linear, organic unfolding of the theological virtues could run as follows. Faith shows the end, hope moves to the end, charity unites one with the end. But this image suggests a harmonious development from faith to hope, a continuity that, in fact, overlooks some critical internal tensions within the experience and structure of faith itself, that only the advent of hope can resolve. Two tensions stand out within faith. First, it is not so much that faith shows the end, but rather that it prompts the mind's ascent to what exceeds the capacity of the human intellect. Faith remains opaque. It therefore makes the believer restless, since, as Aquinas observes, the knowledge of faith does not calm desire, but arouses it. It reveals that which the mind barely grasps, let alone approaches. But the believer wants to know more about what she believes, and so faith remains incomplete. This internal tension within faith, between, on the one hand, the reality to which it assents, and on the other, its own inadequacy for satisfying the desire such assent creates, generates the need for a distinct virtue that brings a believer closer to the divine goal that, although somehow grasped, still exceeds faith's opaque vision. That new virtue, which issues from faith's restlessness, must be in the will, not the intellect, since it is through the will or love that we move to the God who is beyond human understanding. Faith's incompleteness, therefore, can only begin to be resolved by the operation of a distinct virtue of the will that moves a believer to union with the goal, and that virtue is hope. The second tension within the structure of faith arises when this incompleteness of faith is not acknowledged, and, as a result, the fullness of Christian life is shrunk to an unbalanced, even neurotic focus on doctrine and social boundaries. Orthodoxy as headhunting, as I've heard it once described. In this arrested development, Christian identity becomes calcified as it resists allowing itself to undergo a dialectical reworking through the cruciform passage of hope. For a faith that has yet to face difficulties and own up to its own personal and collective imperfections, and instead resorts to a facile apologetics and dismissive defensiveness, may seem to the observer to be more a possession than a gift. Prior to the emergence of a hope that sustains faith through difficult times, there always remains the danger of appropriating faith as a mere identity marker. There is no such danger in hope. The advent of hope makes Christian belief more believable, since it not only proclaims God's truth, but shows God's mercy and power through a non-possessive attitude of humble reliance upon divine help and patient expectation of an eschatological goal. The metaphors of wayfarer and pilgrim convey how the experience of hope addresses the incompleteness of faith's intellectual assent. Moreover, these metaphors negate the contradictions that beset the possessive narrowing of faith into a triumphal and rigid dogmatism, which, according to one theologian, can be called simply bad faith, by which he meant, quote, an explicit confessional stance which is rooted in anxiety and is sustained through dishonesty, pretense, and false apologetics. It appears in the manifold tensions of deception or in the falseness between verbal belief and actual practice. Bad faith constitutes a contradiction at the heart of consciousness, because what is projected as piety or orthodoxy or religious experience is actually a fearful attempt to evade the psychological and social costs of reflection and freedom. End quote. Appropriately, hope's negation of bad faith works through the characteristics that are the opposite of triumphalism and rigidity. Hope negates triumphalism through its greater recognition of and openness to human suffering and perplexity. And hope negates rigidity through its key feature of movement. Greater recognition of this virtue strips away the facile synthesis of what Alistair MacIntyre calls the Catholic bland both and. It similarly undercuts the muscular scholasticism that taught John Courtney Murray to assert that the purpose of theology, quote, was to mount a triumphantly argumentative defense of the faith against error, end quote. The virtue of hope gives rise to humility, because it accepts the need for help that is beyond one's power as it moves towards a goal that is beyond one's reach. It therefore recognizes God as ever greater, as radically transcending the world, and for that very reason, the appropriate source of help and fitting goal for desire. Precisely in hope's inner reworking of the limits, even contradictions of faith, lies its relevance for ecclesial shortcomings. For as we saw, the problem is internal, and so the internal development that hope occasions in the life of the believer will form the basis for any adequate solution. To repeat, hope does not change the theological content of faith, but it does give the following reminder, namely that faith is not a boundary for social belonging, but is the beginning of eternal life. Centrally marked by movement, the experience of hope fashions an adaptive identity that can reverse the seemingly inexhaustible potential of lay Catholics to accept too much second-rate, unaccountable leadership. By registering the imperfections and internal tensions within faith, the virtue of hope moves a believer to expect more. It prepares her to imagine new forms of church, to see God at work in change, not only in continuity. Most importantly, in the context of the abuse crisis, it generates a mindset in which the church can be open to the difficult changes required to prevent such widespread abuse and failure in leadership from happening again. The church's ability to adopt this mindset of hope and thus reform effectively will go a long way to restore its credibility. My second point, as written up on the handout, is as follows. Insofar as hope focuses on the concrete acceptance of faith in particular circumstances, it supports the recent trend in ecclesiology to empower the local church. What does this mean? Well, faith regards a universal belief of the church, but hope regards its acceptance and realization in particular circumstances. As Karl Rahner writes, the universal promise of faith only realizes its authentic nature when it is transformed into the specific and particular promise in which it is applied to the individual. This takes place precisely in virtue of the fact that faith is transformed into hope. The virtue of hope then brings the general universal claims of faith to bear upon specific times and places. This particularizing function of hope supports a contemporary interest in the theology of the local church, that is, on the concrete ways in which Christian faith is lived out amidst the difficulties and opportunities of particular cultures. My point here is simply that if we readily accept, on a personal level, the significance of allowing a universally shared faith to be transformed in its encounter with the particular and the individual, then can we not analogously accept, or at least be open to, a similar transformation in ecclesial structures if they are appropriately devolved from universal to local levels? Beyond suggestive parallels and analogies, one can forward a more direct argument that such a move is in fact appropriate for our times. For if, in the age of nation-states, the 19th century church centralized its authority into a transnational papacy to preserve the international nature of the church, then in the age of the global market today, the devolution of power to the local churches can help defend the particular identities that globalization threatens to dissolve. My appeal to an analogy between the personal and the ecclesial finds force in the recent claim of a British Catholic intellectual, Nicholas Doyle, that today the moral voice of the Catholic Church is not exhausted by the papacy, but must also come from a vigorous college of bishops that speaks from the experiences of the local churches. Quoting Doyle, "The Church of the future will need to draw its moral strength not from its international presence, but from its claim to represent people as they are locally and distinct from the global market. The moral authority of the Church in future will lie, as the Second Vatican Council foresaw, with the College of Bishops. It will be the bishops, rather than specifically the papacy, which will challenge the claim of the global market to express and exhaust the human world. Grand narratives continues, but the little narratives of the victims of the grand process of globalization will be told at a diocesan, parochial, or base community level." End quote. To take the local church more seriously entails a following change of focus from the papacy as the central originator of unity, the vicar of Christ, who appoints leaders in local church dioceses, the vicars of Peter, who then ratify and repeat central decisions, to the Bishop of Rome as an orchestrator of church unity, who listens to and coordinates, and where necessary, adjudicates disagreements between and even disciplines, the accountable leaders and representatives of devolved centres of the church, who express how the shared faith is lived out amidst the concrete difficulties and opportunities of particular times and places. The personal unfolding of the theological virtues, then, has an ecclesial parallel in our context today of a post-traumatic church. A centralized, papal-dominated church, sometimes enforcing faith as a social boundary rather than nurturing it as a theological virtue, faces acute difficulties and needs to change. In drawing upon the resources of hope, the desire for a future difficult yet possible good, it can face those changes, not least by paying attention to the particular experiences of the diverse local churches, where ultimately the difficulties are experienced and where hopefully strategies for renewal can come. Finally, in sharing the very different yet similar experiences of what it means to live and grow as a Christian church in various times and places, there emerges a deeper and more genuine union based on an ecclesial version of what Aristotle calls civic friendship, a recognition of similar yet richly diverse experiences based on the shared love of the same object, in this case, of coming to new life in the Spirit that is patterned on the ministry, death, and resurrection of Christ. This deeper union of friendship only comes through the particularizing moment of hope, in which the local receives its due. The advantage of reflecting on the ecclesial significance of hope is that it marks a path for change. It shows how deeper union in the church will come not from a rigid insistence on a uniform faith as identity marker, but paradoxically on a certain letting go of centralized attempts at control, and granting instead devolution to and trust in the wisdom and particular experiences of local churches. Out of the meeting and cooperation of these devolved centres may emerge a deeper union and thus a more authentic Catholicity. Thank you.
Again, I'd invite you all to just take a moment, let the words settle in, And a thought of your own to bubble up? Our third presenter this evening, M. Shawn Copeland, is a Catholic laywoman. It's Associate Professor of Theology for the Boston College Theology Department and holds an appointment in the interdisciplinary program in African and African Diaspora Studies. She earned her doctorate in systematic theology from Boston College. Prior to returning to join the faculty here, she taught at Marquette University and Yale University Divinity School. Copeland is recognized as one of the most important influences in North America in drawing attention to issues concerning the experience of African American Catholics. She has written more than 80 articles, reviews, and book chapters on such topics as freedom, the cross, discipleship, and embodiment. Copeland is editor of Uncommon Faithfulness, The Black Catholic Experience, 2009, and author of Enfleshing Freedom, Body, Race, and Being, 2010. Shawn?
I'm sorry not to have an accent. Just... Oh, I don't. The contemporary context of global living is compound complex and precarious at every level, biological and psychological, political and economic, cultural, religious, and intellectual. We know the facts. Scientists repeatedly warn us about the damage our lifestyle does to our planetary ecosystem, and these injuries in turn contribute to changes in temperature of the oceans, the spread of drought in deserts, and the reduction of harvests. The atmospheric and geographic shift caused by this trigger food insecurity, hunger, and malnutrition. In the past 5 years alone, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, tsunamis, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions have increased in frequency and ferocity in various regions of our planet, annihilating human populations, devastating animal and plant life, and destroying infrastructure. Poverty and war remain the twin scourges of our world and the principal causes of hunger. Roughly 982 million people live each day on $1 a day or less. Armed conflict spawns the proliferation of refugee camps as brutality and rape drive people from their homes, villages, and towns. The persistence of HIV/AIDS, along with ballooning incidences of polio and tuberculosis, has reawakened old plagues in new places. In both Russian and U.S. prisons, more and more women and men fall prey to multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Large numbers of children, women, and men endure violence to their reputations, persons, and lives because of homophobia, misogyny, and sexism, anti-Semitism, and racism, including anti-immigrant bias. Uncritical affirmation of the liberal market's vulgarization of individuality as license has led to exploitation of the poor and the manipulation and commercialization of desire. Staggered by the fragility of the global economy, we have begun to glimpse just how gravely empty, tasteless market culture has jeopardized and undermined our capacity for being human and for authentic spirituality. Our culture, in its reflective or contemplative mode, is collapsing under the weight of kitsch, which has eviscerated the moral and spiritual content. We are amusing ourselves to death. At the same time, in the past decade, as institution, the Church has initiated a perplexing reassessment of the meaning of the Second Vatican Council. As mystery, the Church is undergoing waves of shattering agony provoked by abuse of persons and authority. As pilgrim people of God, the church edges toward sacramental famine. The cumulative evidence, then, is glaring on almost every level, both as individuals and as community. We feel powerless. On a cultural level, we feel bewildered and estranged by the rapidity of fads and shifts in values. On a social level, we feel vulnerable to the power of our technologies. On an intellectual level, we feel overwhelmed by the amount and intricacy of information required to make good moral and ethical choices. On a religious level, we feel betrayed and ignored by our pastoral leaders, who daily contend with multiple competing and often conflicting demands, and who themselves often feel betrayed and ignored. A prophetic ministry, then, is imperative, Walter Brueggemann argues, when a situation is so new and different that the old traditions no longer supply clear guidance and adequate motivation for facing history responsibly, close quote. My initial summary, then, of our contemporary social, cultural, and religious context supports the claim that we need a prophetic ministry to rightly discern our situation and our freedom. Now, any Christian understanding of prophecy must begin by thinking about prophecy as it developed in ancient Israel. The Hebrew prophets were women and men who were chosen and called by God to speak or enact a word given to them by God for the life and the future of God's people. The prophets were invested with a critical public function, and the prophet's ability to read the signs of the times was indispensable for the people's relationship with God. Prophets bore witness, testified to what they saw, and stood up and against whatever avoided or violated the demands of the covenantal relationship. The prophet's task was not one of prediction, for truth events may never be manufactured, and divine power can never be subordinated to magic. Nor was the prophet's task one of proclaiming immutable decrees. Rather, the prophets were signposts sent by God to orient the people to their freedom and the possibilities of its realization. The prophet's task, Martin Buber explains, involves a question, a summons to decision. The true prophet sets the audience before the choice, not the choice before the audience. When the prophet summons the people before the message of God, the future is not something already fixed or concluded. The future depends upon the people's real decision, their choice in freedom. Thus, the prophet witnesses to hope, hope in the people's relationship with God and with one another, hope in the people's disposition before their freedom. And as Leon Feuer observes, for Israel and its prophets, hope was not so much a heavenly gift as a divine requirement. So, what is a praxis of hope? This is the title of this talk. So I've given you a definition that I've worked out for myself about what I mean by a praxis of hope. With that phrase, I want to refer to the dynamic cluster of attitudes, choices, and habits that flow from a more or less steady response to the Christian call to conversion, that seeks prayerful solitude and communal engagement, that shoulders responsibility for the least of Jesus' family, that struggles against all forms of fatalism and yearns in eager obedience for the coming reign of God. Such a praxis is at once the cradle and sign of prophetic ministry in the church. So having named these ingredients, I want to transpose some of these themes offered by Walter Brueggemann in his work on prophecy, and particularly in Jeremiah. I want to transpose this into some characteristics of hope-filled prophetic ministry. So I have 5 of these I want to just lift up for reflection and discussion. The first is personal and private prayer. Personal and private prayer are absolutely necessary, but never privatized faith. Never privatized faith. This is what characterizes the life of those who are called to prophetic ministry. Without fidelity to a life of prayer, the words spoken are hollow, living is shallow, and the capacity for discernment is diverted. The exercise of prophetic ministry, then, demands an integrity which requires those called to be living signs of God's investment in the history of God's people. Secondly, a prophetic ministry protests idolatry and ideology. On the one hand, prophetic ministry uncovers and denounces those idols which dare to disguise themselves as divine or which dare to handle God mechanistically. On the other hand, because the attempt to pass as or to master divinity requires an ideology that obscures or intimidates, prophetic ministry exposes and protests all half-truths wherever they are found. Thus, prophetic ministry is critically alert to the world in which we live, discerns the signs of the times, and uncovers what is not of God, what is idolatrous, what attempts to usurp God's place in our lives and in our world. God must be God. No nation, no political party, no social class, no gender, no race, no particular ministry, no theology, no church is God. God must be God. Ideology critique accompanies the unmasking of idols. And thus, under the tutelage of the Holy Spirit, prophetic ministry turns the spotlight on oppressive structures or institutions, delineates their implications, and uncovers those uncritical assumptions which allow those structures to appear natural, logical, necessary, and permanent. Third, prophetic ministry reads the signs of the times, uncovers and meets hidden and neglected suffering. Because social oppression tampers with key values and meanings to insinuate ideological interpretations of the culture, the challenge of reading the signs of the times is really quite difficult. Prophetic ministry takes responsibility for this reading. It demystifies social oppression, naming the intentional distortions and manipulations of the cultural and social orders to the advantage of those who are privileged and to the disadvantage of those who are excluded and despised. Indeed, prophetic ministry calls us as church to the demands of ethical living, to act concretely for justice in the here and now for the sake of the gospel. Fourth, prophetic ministry maintains an open and questioning posture toward all established power. Through coercion, corruption, or seduction, all the various forms of established power seek legitimation and hegemony. They come with glittering offers of security and success, or with threats and intimidation. In return, they urge us to lower our vision, restrict our horizon, and cling to the immediate. But what is on offer aims to compromise our openness and bind our freedom. Prophetic ministry contests any abuse of power. While acknowledging power matters enormously, prophetic ministry adamantly insists power does not matter ultimately. Prophetic ministry then repudiates any domestication of the message of the gospel, any repressive limitation on human agency in the historical process of our salvation. It witnesses to church and society that God alone is the locus of human hope. Thus, prophetic ministry stands critically attentive and responsive to, but independent of present circumstances. It helps us to understand that God does not absolutize the present. Thus, we should be wary of taking the present with excessive seriousness. The future God desires for us, the plans God has in mind for us for a future full of hope, relativizes the present that we may have come to overvalue. God, in God's own unqualified and unrestricted freedom, will gift us with a future that we cannot imagine, for God has staked the gift of that future, indeed the future of divine life, in us, in our openness to the divine and to the human. Fifth and finally, prophetic ministry is an act of unyielding hope that resists despair. Paulo Freire regards hope as an ontological need. In other words, we cannot live without hope. We cannot be human without hope. Nor without hope shall we drink wine with Jesus in the household of God as he promised. Prophetic ministry sets us before our freedom and offers us an account of hope that expands all our perceived horizons of possibility, broadening our landscape of reality in such a way as to set our present circumstances in a wider perspective and thereby to rob it of its absoluteness. Such an account of hope liberates and invigorates. It transfigures every empirical present by relating it to the vision of the future that God has. These characteristics, then, suggest what I think is a capacity for living in time while looking toward the eschatological future, which is actually God's gift of the future. They point us toward a way of orienting ourselves as a people of hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn. Again, we'll just take a moment, collect a thought. All right, for our next segment, the panelists are going to come forward and respond to one another, and maybe even me. But as they move forward, I invite you to just stand up and spin around and feel your body. Don't go too far. Don't go anywhere. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, we'll see how much they've got within themselves. We'll invite the panelists to respond to one another, ask each other some questions, have a little bit of a conversation here, and then when they've exhausted themselves or when I'm exhausted with them, we'll open it to the floor so you'll have a chance to raise questions or thoughts. So would anyone like to pick up first?
Sure. Well, I was struck when I heard you both speak that, Richard, you began with talking about optimism and then ended up with a discussion of the church as a sacrament of hope. And then, Shawn, when you were speaking, you began with a lot of reasons for despair.
All going down.
And then talked about ministry as prophetic witness. And I was just struck, I'm wondering if could you think of the church as a sacrament of hope because of its prophetic witness? That's why it's giving hope.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that the church as church has a prophetic role. Although there are differing ways in which that functions. I mean, there is within the church a segment of the church which has prophetic responsibility for us. I mean, consecrated life has the role of a prophetic voice in the church. Part of what happens, I think, in terms of consecrated life is that it calls us to an awareness of our failure to embrace the evangelical counsels and to live, beyond the immediate, to live beyond the present. But I think both of you pointed out ways in which the church, as church, has failed. I mean, we fail the mystery in this sense. So that the prophetic ministry within the church, we need one, is I guess my point. We need one. And I'm not sure that some segments of the church are able to exercise that ministry right now.
Yeah.
One of the Paul Crowley's book that I quoted, his book called Unwanted Wisdom, the subtitle is something like Suffering and the Cross. But one of his phrases that I've carried around with me for the last 18 months or so since I've read that book is that hope involves, and I used it in the speech, that hope involves faithfulness to what horrifies. I find the most extraordinary phrase, that what horrifies is surely by definition what we most want to run away from. But it's by facing it and naming it and letting it in that I think the prophetic begins to become possible. I mean, the whole nature of the biblical prophetic charism is that no one wanted the job.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And it's when they let in what it was going to cost them, but allowed themselves to be transformed by the God who was offering, that in fact they become what they are. They become prophets. But it seems to me you've got to have the two things together. You've got to be prepared to face what you don't want to face.
It's a bit like the way Aquinas sets it up, that hope as a virtue is between two extremes. On the one hand, despair. Things look pretty bad and horrifying. Let's give up. What can little old me do by myself? And on the other hand, presumption. Things are fine. It's optimism. Things will get better. And he keeps in his sort of virtue ethics a sort of the mean between two extremes. That there's a recognition of difficulty, but nonetheless an ability to move on.
And in line with that, one of the things that struck me from between the three of us was words that we had in common. This is an exhaustive list, but words like tension, struggle, challenge, complex, as well as the more obvious words like pilgrim in relation to the church. And it seemed to me that those words like struggle and challenge and tension reinforce that hope is not a cheap grace, that you don't get there by wanting to get there. You actually, there's really something that goes on here that demands something of you. So when you open, Dominic, with the Aquinas on a difficult yet possible good, it's not, you can't jump over the difficult. That's part of where you need to be.
One of the things that struck me as I was listening to all three of them is the role of the baptized in this, because as someone who's worked long and hard with lay members of the church, they're frequently saying, well, the church ought to. So when they say the church is the sacrament of hope, well, they really interpret it and say, well, those bishops, my pastor, all those people who have a collar around their neck ought to be doing a better job, so on and so forth. And what struck me was I was listening to these three is how is it that the whole of the baptized somehow participate in this process? Just as Shawn was saying, God is God and God must be God, so that I was thinking, and the church must be the church, and not say, well, somebody else who's in charge really ought to do all this hoping stuff. And hoping and reforming and prophetic work. And I guess Shawn, you've actually said quite a bit already about this, but if you'd add to it, or the others would add to it, what do you see as the kind of the personal place of the baptized just in this process? Instead of waiting around for, I hope somebody who's in charge makes a change. So.
Well, I think, first of all, the baptized is everybody. Because you can't get here without being baptized, So, but when you think about lay people, I don't have a name. I'm talking about prophetic ministry and those who are called. Mm-hmm. So I'm not suggesting that only one segment of people are prophetic. And I did say that I think the natural place in the church where we seek a prophetic way of life and a prophetic voice is consecrated life. But that's also lay people. Those are not necessarily ordained people, although there are some ordained people who are members of religious orders. But I think that's the natural place to look. But there are also other places, so that, the point about the prophets not wanting their job is absolutely, that's the point. You can't make yourself a prophet. Everybody who runs around talking about we're ready to be prophets for this and prophets for that, you haven't figured out what it means. Mm-hmm. If you look at the cross and you know what prophetic life means and what it costs, that's the goal, that's the end of prophecy right there. It's Jeremiah who disappears in the end. We hear nothing, from him once he's gone off. They've been let off in the last little group, and he doesn't want to go, but they take him with them, and we never hear from him. We don't know where he's buried, what happened to him. Isaiah walks around for 3 years wearing just kind of a loincloth. There are all sorts of things that happen to prophets that are not really desirable. But it means, and this is the point about, I guess, being horrified, if you're called, then you're both frightened first of all, by the call and its obligation and responsibility, but because you're standing between God and human beings, what you see from human beings may be horrifying, because what human beings do wounds God. I mean, there's a lot more to be said about all of this, but it can only be compressed in a certain amount of time. So, I mean, that's what I really think. I'm not looking for, oh, these are the prophets and we're not. I think the prophets are probably out there in this room. There are people who have something to say to us as church that maybe they don't know yet that they have that mission or that call or that vocation.
And I think, Theresa, on your point about all the baptized as church and not waiting for somebody else to do it, right. If every discussion of the church did not become reduced to a discussion of authority, but to a discussion on mission, we'd be in a much richer place. And we'd be in a place where we could think about authority and structure differently. We skew our conversation because our first point, and I guess it's understandable in lots of ways, but our first point is a discussion about authority. I think it needs to be our last point.
And even in the question of mission, for the baptized to say, well, I'm part of that mission too. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sometimes they're a bit slow to pick up on that.
Mm.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, comments, questions among yourselves?
No.
All right. Well, we're going to open it up to the floor. Sarah has a mic, so those of you who have a question, please raise your hand. She's there in the back.
The connection between hope and being a prophet. And what I've been kind of sensing is that each of us needs to come to our own hope. And that means acknowledging and addressing whatever struggles and darknesses and whatever we find in ourselves and in our own personal lives. And only then can we be prophets. But we have to have personal hope before we can then be prophetic, because we have to have hope in order to be prophets. I don't know if that is kind of what you were also saying, because I heard both prophet and hope.
Well, prophets witness to hope, but we can't assume that any of us are prophets. I mean, I don't think you're doing that. I mean,
I believe that all the baptized are called to be prophets in one way or the other. So whether it's to be a prophet in the church, to the abuses in the church, I don't know, but each of us needs to be a prophet.
well, that may be a way of, I guess, thinking about it. That's not how I'm thinking about it. I don't think that every single person is called to a prophetic ministry. I think Christian life should be prophetic. That is to say, as a corporate body, we should have a prophetic, we should realize ourselves in a way that bespeaks the hope which is given to us by God, and which points toward the kind of future that God wants to give us. So I guess what I'm also trying to say is that maybe I have a certain sense of reluctance, like many prophets in the Hebrew Bible, about taking on the little designation of prophet, because it doesn't, no one volunteers for this, you know. But Christian life, in a certain sense, should be countercultural, and in a way is prophetic. I mean, I'm speaking very, you know, I'm not speaking in profound theological terms right now. I'm just saying that I think that this is part of what's expected of us if we commit ourselves to the gospel. But I think that what we're witnessing to is a hope. This is the point about the difficulty, I think, that we can't see what it is. We don't know what it is. Which is this right? I mean, is this the case?
Well, that you don't know.
Well, I don't know that we know what the end is.
You wouldn't understand what the end is, but there'd be a general sense of the movement towards
something. Yes, yeah.
One way to connect the two, it seems to me, that is, if a prophet by definition is the one who stands and speaks a word before others, a word that is not their own, a word that actually has to come from another, if that's the biblical notion of prophecy, then hope too, and both Dominic and I made this point, is not something self-initiated, doesn't come out of our own resources. Hope is a gift from having been summoned by another out of what might overwhelm us with despair. So the key thing is taking this notion of prophecy as speaking that is which becomes your own. So your point, sister, about that we need to have hope and before we proclaim it. But it comes from outside of us, and that's then too, I think, the basis of what enables us to be prophetic.
Which is why some form of a spiritual life, if you will, is so crucial. Some form of prayer, some form of worshipful engagement. I mean, all of that is absolutely necessary because your self-initiating is a very good word for. I guess we're circumscribing that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your papers, which I found very stimulating. And I wanted to speak in a way to the issue, or raise in a different way the issue that's kind of come up about hope and imagination, because Shawn in her talk said, in a way I think rightly and importantly, that somehow hope orients us towards a future that God can bring about and that's beyond our capacity to imagine it. But at the same time, Dominic spoke in a way that I often think is right about the importance of creativity in hope, or that hope as a pattern of response to adversity invites us to be creative in imagining. I think this is sort of the way you put it, imagining another possibility, or imagining a way things might be, and sort of striving to bring that about. So, I mean, I think there's an interesting kind of duality there in hope as a trust in what only God can do, and yet at the same time a kind of commitment to doing the best that I can do to be creative in the face of an extraordinarily complex cultural and historical moment. So I just wanted to invite maybe some more discussion of that, because I thought it was a very interesting kind of, not contrast, but complementarity in the talks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it gets at the idea of God operates through our freedom and intelligence, and that desire to, I think as the first questioner was pointing out, see things in their context, to have a grasp not only of these sensational faults, but the culture in which they took place, and not too quickly jump to a kind of what you might call a prophetic license, like a poetic license, just to sort of rail off lists of things that have gone wrong, but to try and give a broader understanding. But then finally, within the context of that understanding, is that we don't know what the resolution will look like. As one of my colleagues summarized eschatology as we'll know later, which I thought was a nice way to, there's an openness, there's a spirit, and we can register the signs by which we have an affective sense that this is moving in the right direction, but we can't know the sort of details of the final outworking of the plan.
Yeah. Adam?
Thank you all. I was wondering, you talked a lot about, all of you I think talked a lot about the need to embrace something horrific, and you pointed to the cross as an example of that. One word that I didn't hear a lot of, but it kind of had expected to, was the step beyond that. Can you talk a little bit about how our understanding of the resurrection also fits into where we need to go as a people with hope?
I'm not a resurrection person.
Adam, I think if we weren't talking about the resurrection explicitly, I think we're all talking out of the resurrection, which is that in the light of the resurrection, it's about how we live in the present, not simply about how you live in the future. And part of that in the particular dimensions that we're all mentioning, the abuse crisis and the list of the globalised world and its deleterious effects that Shawn went through, is that part of it is that it gives us the strength to face that, to be able to name, so that what would cause despair does not have the last word, which seems to me is the archetypal experience of resurrection, that death will not have the last word. So being able to confront our present, we do out of the conviction of the resurrection. And then it's not that the expectation of resurrection is simply that all this will go away and there will be something better, but that this will be transformed. So that it's not that death will have the last word, but nor is it that we won't have to die. And it's living in that space that allows us to name what is, and yet, in the language we've all been using, be people of hope, which it seems to me is a profound expression of resurrection faith.
One perhaps over-tidy way of putting it is thinking of the three theological virtues together, faith, hope and charity. When we think of faith, that's in terms of what is true. We approach God under the aspect of truth. And in particular for Christians in terms of the incarnation, the distinctive role of Christ as incarnate. In hope, we experience God's power and mercy as we move towards a distant, difficult goal. And there's very much an appropriation of the doctrine of the cross, of crucifixion that you mentioned. But in charity, we approach, or we are united to God in terms of God's goodness in itself. So having gone through that experience that the sister was talking about, experiences of difficulty, and registering God's power and mercy, we are then empowered to be agents of mercy to others. And that's the fruit, you by their fruits you shall judge them. So I think our experience of charity and love with God and with neighbours, and the fruits of those, as Aquinas talks about, of mercy, compassion to others, and joy and peace, and as Cranmer puts it in the book of Common Prayer, peace that the world cannot give. That kind of emphasis, I think, is similar, is our existential resonance, if you like, with the notion of resurrection.
Richard, you made what I thought was at the time a very bold statement, and you tempered it later with an interesting dialectic. And I was hoping you could synthesize the statement with the dialectic a little more, the whole panel, if you could. The statement, it was that, well, now I've lost it. The church's sacrament orients people to God of Jesus Christ and not to itself. That strikes me as a point saying that it's possible to orient oneself to God, maybe not through the church. Then your dialectic later was that the church is only a sacrament, it is not God, compared to the church is a sacrament and does point to God. Mm-hmm. So if the panel could discuss whether it's possible for people who have been in the church and their experience does not mesh with the teachings of the church, if it's possible that for them to still hope to be pointed towards God, even if they're not pointed along with the church in the church's teachings.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Paul. The point about the distance with the sacrament between what it is and what it isn't. What it is, particularly in the context of the church, is where we name explicitly what God in Christ has done, where we name explicitly the gift of the Spirit given to the world and its history through Christ. So those things act as guarantees for all people. That's part of our faith, that it isn't simply that operates when you come to it explicitly. That Spirit is the Spirit of reconciliation, the reconciliation that Christ has brought about. So how it then works in the lives of each one of us, and where we stand in relationship to the exercise of that grace, we can say of part of the reason we only canonize people after they've died and not before is that then we can say definitively that God has been at work in their lives and that they've responded to it. For the rest of us, all of us, we don't get to know that. As Rana would say, there is no human judgment day. Only God gets to judge. But the Spirit at work in the church is the guarantee that God offers grace to all of us. Now, how anyone responds, whether they're inside the church or whether they're at odds with the church, ultimately that's for God to work out. Now, we might say being in the church and making advantage of the sacraments and so on is not a guarantee, but it's a support that we are moving in the direction of God. But it doesn't guarantee it. You and I, all of us, still have to stand before God at the end of our life, and God determines. So I think we live with that tension between where we can say the church offers a positive aid to salvation, if you like, not a guarantee but an aid, and where that same aid expressed in the church, namely the life of grace, is available to everybody, even though we don't know. I mean, it's Paul's letter, isn't it, that even I don't know, my conscience might not reproach me, but even I don't know where I stand with God. And I think we all live in that space. None of us have a guarantee. All of us have to be judged. There are more active supports in the life of the church to aid us, but they don't guarantee that we've taken advantage of them even, let alone that they've had an outcome. And in the end, we leave it all to God. That's why he stays up at night and I go to bed.
Are you sure? I think it's about freedom. I think this is really about freedom, in the sense of you're saying taking advantage of it, making use of it, freely choosing. And since there's no abrogation of our freedom, then it really is about freely seeking, freely responding, and freely choosing, freely. I mean, Ronner goes so far as, I guess, he still says that, I guess there's no change in this, that, grace in the mode of offer and grace in the mode of reception, grace in the mode of rejection. It's all grace. So I think this is I think it's an interesting question. I think it's about freedom, which is at stake here.
Anything to add? Okay. Well, thank you, Dominic and Shawn and Richard. It's you come out on a dark night and you hope for a thoughtful word. So let's hope for that. But you also hope that it ends in a timely fashion. So we have come to the end of our time. Join me in thanking our three presenters with their thoughts.